The morning mist clung to the ancient cedar trees like ghostly fingers as Thomas Cuinan dragged his withered left leg through the forest undergrowth. Each step sent sharp pain shooting up his spine, but he had learned long ago to swallow his groans. The other scouts from his village had already returned from their missions, their faces glowing with pride as they shared tales of successful hunts and enemy sightings. Thomas knew he would have no such stories to tell. At 19, Thomas had once been the fastest runner in his Nootka village on Vancouver Island. His keen eyes could spot a deer track from 50 paces, and his silent footsteps had earned him the nickname Ghost Walker among his people. But that was before the accident that changed everything. 2 winters ago, while tracking a wounded bear through treacherous mountain terrain, Thomas had slipped on ice-covered rocks and fallen into a deep ravine. The impact shattered his left leg and damaged his hip so severely that the village healer, despite all her knowledge of bones and herbs, could not fully repair the damage. Now Thomas walked with a pronounced limp, his left foot dragging slightly with each labored step. The other young men his age had moved on to become respected hunters and warriors, while Thomas struggled to complete the simplest scouting missions. The village elders still assigned him tasks out of respect for his family lineage, but Thomas could see the pity in their eyes. Even worse was the way children would stare and whisper when he passed, their innocent curiosity cutting deeper than any intentional cruelty. His current mission was to check the old hunting trails along the eastern ridge for signs of rival tribes. It was considered easy work, suitable for someone with his limitations. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas that he, who had once been chosen for the most dangerous reconnaissance missions, was now given assignments that even the youngest apprentice scouts could handle. But he accepted each task without complaint, determined to prove he still had value to his people. The trail wound upward through dense forest, and Thomas had to stop frequently to rest his aching leg. During one such break, he noticed something unusual. Fresh horse tracks crossed the path, but they weren't from the small, hardy ponies his people rode. These were larger prints from the heavy horses that the mountain settlers used. More concerning was that the tracks were only a few hours old and headed directly toward Nootka territory. Thomas examined the tracks more closely, his old skills as a scout returning despite his physical limitations. There were at least 6 horses, probably more. The depth of the hoof prints suggested the riders were heavily armed. This wasn't a peaceful trading party or a group of lost travelers. This looked like a raiding party, and they were moving fast toward his village. Fear shot through Thomas as he realized the implications. His people were not prepared for an attack. Most of the warriors were away on a hunting expedition, leaving only the elders, women, and children behind with a small guard. If these strangers meant harm, his village would be defenseless. Thomas tried to move faster, but his damaged leg betrayed him. He stumbled and fell hard, crying out as pain exploded through his body. Lying in the dirt, Thomas felt the familiar wave of despair wash over him. Here was a moment when his people truly needed him, when his skills as a scout could make the difference between life and death for everyone he loved, and his broken body was failing him. He thought of his younger sister, Morningstar, who always greeted him with a smile despite his limitations. He thought of his elderly parents who had never once made him feel like a burden. The village children who still looked up to him, even if they sometimes stared at his limp. With tremendous effort, Thomas pulled himself to his feet. His leg throbbed with each heartbeat, but he forced himself to continue. He couldn't run like he once did, but he could still think and plan. There was an old deer trail that cut through the forest, a shortcut that would save him precious time if he could navigate it with his limitations. It was steep and treacherous, exactly the kind of terrain that had caused his original injury, but it might be his only chance to reach the village before the strangers did. As he made his way toward the hidden trail, Thomas caught sight of smoke rising in the distance. Not the thin, controlled smoke of cooking fires, but thick, dark columns that spoke of destruction. His heart sank as he realized he might already be too late. The strangers had reached settlements before his village, and they were leaving devastation in their wake. The old deer trail proved even more challenging than Thomas had feared. His good leg shook with exhaustion as he navigated loose rocks and steep drops. Several times he had to use his hands to pull himself over obstacles that he could have easily jumped in his youth. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool mountain air, and he could taste blood where he had bitten his tongue to keep from crying out in pain. Halfway down the trail, Thomas heard something that made him freeze in terror. Voices, speaking in the mountain dialect he recognized but couldn't fully understand. They were close, very close, and moving in his direction. Thomas quickly hid behind a large boulder, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure they would hear it. 3 men emerged from the trees below him, leading their horses up the steep path. They were armed with rifles and had the hard, weathered look of men accustomed to violence. Their clothes were stained with smoke and worse things that Thomas didn't want to identify. As they passed his hiding spot, he heard enough of their conversation to understand they were scouts for a larger group, and they were indeed heading for his village. After the men disappeared up the trail, Thomas remained hidden for several more minutes trying to plan his next move. His leg was nearly useless now, and he knew he couldn't outrun mounted men even on his best day, but he had to warn his village. He had to find some way to give his people a chance to defend themselves or escape. As despair threatened to overwhelm him again, Thomas heard a sound that chilled his blood. War cries echoed from the direction of his village, carried on the wind like the screams of demons. The attack had begun, and he was still too far away to help. For the first time since his accident, Thomas felt tears stream down his face as he realized he had failed his people when they needed him most. The war cries faded into an ominous silence that was somehow worse than the sounds of battle. Thomas forced himself to move, half crawling, half sliding down the rocky slope toward his village. Every instinct screamed at him to be careful, to stay hidden, but the desperate need to know the fate of his family drove him forward despite the agony in his damaged leg. When he finally reached the edge of the village clearing, the sight that greeted him made his stomach lurch. Smoke rose from several burned longhouses and bodies lay scattered across the ground. The raiders had been efficient and brutal in their attack. Thomas could see that some of his people had tried to flee toward the forest, but few had made it past the clearing before being cut down. Hidden behind a fallen log, Thomas searched desperately for any sign of his family among the survivors being herded together by the armed raiders. His heart leaped when he spotted his sister Morningstar among a group of women and children. She was alive, but her face was streaked with tears and dirt. Their elderly parents were nowhere to be seen, and Thomas felt a cold dread settle in his chest. The leader of the raiders, a tall man with graying hair and cruel eyes, stood before the captured villagers. Thomas could hear his voice clearly as he addressed the survivors in broken Nootka, mixed with English. "You people live on good land," the man said, gesturing broadly at the village. "Rich soil, fresh water, plenty of game. My people need this land. You can work for us, serve us, or you can join your dead friends. Choice is yours." Morningstar stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly despite her obvious terror. "This is our ancestral home," she declared. "Our people have lived here for generations beyond counting. You have no right to take it from us." The raider leader backhanded her across the face, sending her stumbling backward. "Little savage thinks she can tell us about rights," he sneered. Several of his men laughed. "Let me explain rights to you. We have guns. We have power. That gives us the right to take whatever we want." Thomas felt rage build inside him like a forest fire. His sister's courage in the face of such danger filled him with pride, but he knew her defiance would only bring more violence. He had to do something, but what could one crippled scout accomplish against a dozen armed raiders? His bow was back in the village, probably destroyed in the attack. He carried only a small knife, useless against men with rifles. As if reading his thoughts, the raider leader continued his speech to the survivors. "Any of your warriors who escaped better stay away. We got sentries posted all around. Anyone tries to be a hero, we start killing prisoners, starting with the young ones." The leader's eyes settled on Morningstar again, and Thomas saw something in that gaze that made his blood run cold. "Matter of fact, I think I'll keep this one for myself. Got some spirit that needs breaking." Several of the raiders laughed again, and Thomas watched his sister's face pale with understanding. That night, hidden in the forest surrounding the village, Thomas tried to formulate a plan. The raiders had indeed posted guards, but they were overconfident, probably drunk on their easy victory. They had built a large fire in the center of the village and were celebrating loudly, passing around bottles of whiskey. The prisoners were tied up near one of the intact longhouses, guarded by only 2 men who seemed more interested in the celebration than their duties. Thomas knew this might be his only chance. The raiders would probably move on in the morning, taking the survivors as slaves or worse. If he was going to act, it had to be tonight. But his leg made stealth nearly impossible, and he couldn't move fast enough to rescue anyone before raising an alarm. As he wrestled with his limitations, Thomas heard a sound that made him freeze. Footsteps were approaching his hiding spot, moving with the careful precision of someone trying to avoid detection. Thomas gripped his knife, preparing to sell his life dearly if he had been discovered. Instead of a raider, a figure emerged from the shadows that made Thomas blink in confusion. It was a woman, but unlike any woman he had ever seen. She was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in buckskin pants and a wool shirt like a man. Her long brown hair was braided with strips of leather, and she carried a rifle with the easy familiarity of someone who knew how to use it. Most shocking of all, her skin was pale, marking her as one of the mountain settlers. The woman spotted Thomas immediately, raising her rifle in his direction. For a moment they stared at each other in tense silence. Then she seemed to notice his injured leg, and the obvious fact that he posed no immediate threat. She lowered her weapon slightly but kept it ready. "You're one of the villagers," she said quietly in accented but understandable Nootka. "Thought all the men were dead or captured." Thomas found his voice with difficulty. "I was scouting when they attacked. Came back too late to help." The shame of his failure burned in his throat. The woman studied him for a long moment, her sharp green eyes taking in his condition. "Name's Sarah McKenna," she said finally. "I've been tracking this raiding party for 3 days. They hit my cabin, killed my husband, burned everything we built together." The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and Thomas felt a flicker of understanding. "I am Thomas Cunin. They have my sister among the prisoners." Sarah nodded grimly. "I saw her. Brave girl standing up to them like that. Stupid, but brave." She paused, studying the village below. "These aren't just random raiders. They're part of a larger group trying to clear native villages from the whole region. Been hitting settlements for weeks, taking land for some eastern logging company. Can you help free the prisoners?" Thomas asked desperately. Sarah looked at him skeptically. "With what army?" "There's a dozen of them, 2 of us, and one of us can barely walk." Her bluntness stung, but Thomas appreciated her honesty. "I may be crippled, but I know every trail and hiding place in these mountains," Thomas said. "I can still think and plan, and I would rather die trying to save my people than live knowing I did nothing." Something in his voice seemed to reach Sarah. She was quiet for a long moment, then set down her rifle. "My husband always said I was too stubborn for my own good." "Guess he was right." She looked directly at Thomas. "If we do this, we do it together. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We're outnumbered and outgunned, so we'll have to be smarter than they are." "You would risk your life for strangers?" Thomas asked, hardly daring to believe it. Sarah's expression hardened. "They're not strangers to me anymore. Anyone these bastards hurt is my concern now. Your people didn't deserve this, just like my husband didn't deserve to die protecting our home." She picked up her rifle again. "Besides, I made a promise at my husband's grave. I swore I'd make them pay for what they did. Maybe helping you save your sister is part of keeping that promise." Sarah McKenna proved to be unlike anyone Thomas had ever encountered. As they planned their desperate rescue attempt, she demonstrated a practical knowledge of warfare that impressed even his experienced scout's mind. She had been tracking the raiding party not just for revenge, but to learn their patterns, their weaknesses, their habits. "They're sloppy when they drink," Sarah explained, sketching a rough map in the dirt with a stick. "Posted guards, but they rotate them every few hours instead of keeping the same men alert all night. Makes it easier for us because tired guards make mistakes." Thomas studied her crude but accurate diagram of his own village. "The prisoners are being held in the longhouse near the creek. It has a back entrance that most outsiders wouldn't notice, but the guards will see anyone approaching from that direction." "Not if we create a distraction," Sarah said. She pointed to the far side of the village where the raiders had stored their horses. "Stampede their mounts, maybe set fire to their supply wagon. While they're chasing horses in the dark, we slip the prisoners out the back." It was a reasonable plan, but Thomas could see several problems. "My people are tied with rope. Cutting them all free will take time we won't have, and some of them are wounded from the attack. They won't be able to run fast enough to escape pursuit." Sarah considered this, chewing her lower lip thoughtfully. "How well do you know the mountain trails above the village?" "Better than anyone," Thomas replied without boasting. It was simply fact. Even with his damaged leg, he could navigate those paths in complete darkness. "Then we don't run. We hide." Sarah's eyes gleamed with a new idea. "There must be caves, overhangs, places where a large group could shelter until the raiders give up searching." Thomas nodded slowly. "There's an old bear cave about 2 miles up the ridge. Hidden entrance, multiple chambers inside. My people used it as a refuge during wars with rival tribes, but getting there with wounded prisoners in the dark with my leg. He trailed off, the impossibility of it settling over him. Your leg isn't the problem, Sarah said firmly. The problem is those guards and the distance to safety. We solve those one at a time. She reached into her pack and pulled out several items that made Thomas's eyes widen. In addition to her rifle, Sarah carried 2 pistols, a large knife, several lengths of rope, and what appeared to be small cloth bags filled with gunpowder. My husband was a mining engineer before we came to the mountains, Sarah explained, noting Thomas's surprised expression. Taught me about explosives, among other things. These little charges won't bring down a mountain, but they'll make enough noise and confusion to serve our purpose. As the night wore on, they refined their plan. Sarah would circle around to the horse corral while Thomas, despite his limitations, would position himself near the prisoner longhouse. When Sarah's distraction began, Thomas would slip inside and start cutting bonds while she created chaos on the far side of the village. The biggest risk was the time it would take to free everyone and guide them to safety. What if they catch you? Thomas asked as they prepared to separate. Sarah checked her weapons one final time. Then I buy you as much time as I can with my life. Your job is to get those people to safety no matter what happens to me. I cannot ask you to sacrifice yourself for my people, Thomas protested. You're not asking. I'm choosing. Sarah's voice was steady, but Thomas could see the pain behind her determination. Those raiders took everything from me. My home, my future, the man I loved more than life itself. If dying to save your people means they lose something important too, then it's a trade I'm willing to make. Thomas felt humbled by her courage. Here was a woman who owed him and his people nothing. Yet she was prepared to risk everything for strangers. If we survive this, I will be in your debt for the rest of my life. If we survive this, you won't owe me anything, Sarah replied. We'll just be 2 people who helped each other when it mattered most. They moved into position as the raider celebration reached its peak. The guards were indeed becoming careless, occasionally wandering away from their posts to get closer to the fire and the bottles being passed around. Thomas used these moments to work his way closer to the longhouse, his damaged leg making every step an exercise in controlled agony. Through a crack in the wooden walls, he could see the prisoners inside. Morningstar was sitting near the back wall, her hands bound but her spirit clearly unbroken. Several other women and children from the village were with her, along with a few elderly men who had been too slow to escape the initial attack. Thomas counted 15 prisoners total. More than he had hoped were still alive. The sound of Sarah's first explosion came just after midnight, a sharp crack that echoed across the valley, followed immediately by the terrified whinnying of horses. The raiders' celebration stopped abruptly, as men began shouting and running toward the commotion. Thomas saw both guards abandon their posts to investigate, exactly as Sarah had predicted. He slipped around to the back of the longhouse, his heart pounding. The rear entrance was barely wide enough for one person. Hidden behind hanging cedar mats that had been there so long, most people forgot they concealed a doorway. Thomas pushed through, his knife already in his hand. Thomas! Morningstar's whispered exclamation was filled with shock and relief. We thought you were dead. Not yet, sister, Thomas replied, sawing at the ropes binding her wrists. But we will be if we don't move quickly. As he freed each prisoner, Thomas explained the escape plan in urgent whispers. The wounded would be helped by those who were able, and everyone would follow him up the mountain trail to the hidden cave. No one was to speak once they left the longhouse, no matter what they heard happening in the village below. Another explosion shattered the night, this one accompanied by the orange glow of fire. Sarah was keeping her part of the bargain, creating maximum chaos to cover their escape. Thomas could hear the raiders shouting orders, their voices angry and confused. Some were chasing scattered horses, while others fought to contain the fire that was now spreading to their supply wagon. The last prisoner was freed just as a raider appeared in the main entrance of the longhouse, his silhouette backlit by the fire outside. For a moment he stood there, trying to understand what he was seeing. Then he opened his mouth to shout an alarm. Thomas threw his knife with all the skill that had once made him the village's best scout. The blade took the raider in the throat, dropping him silently before he could raise the alarm. It was the first man Thomas had ever killed, and he was surprised by how little he felt about it in the moment. There would be time for reflection later if they survived. Move, he whispered urgently to the freed prisoners. Follow me and stay quiet. Leading 15 people up a treacherous mountain trail in complete darkness, while trying to remain silent, would have been challenging for Thomas, even before his injury. With his damaged leg, it seemed impossible, but desperation gave him strength he didn't know he possessed, and the knowledge that Sarah was risking her life to give them this chance drove him forward despite the pain. The first part of the trail was the steepest. Winding up through loose rocks and fallen logs, Thomas had to stop frequently to help the wounded, biting back groans as his own injury flared with each awkward movement. Morningstar stayed close beside him, helping to support an elderly woman whose arm had been broken during the raid. The woman's labored breathing seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest, and Thomas feared it would carry back to the village below. Behind them, the chaos continued. More explosions echoed through the valley, followed by gunshots and angry shouting. The orange glow of fire painted the sky, suggesting that Sarah's diversions were working better than they had dared hope. But Thomas knew their head start wouldn't last long. Once the raiders realized their prisoners were gone, they would organize a search party with torches and dogs. The thought of dogs made Thomas's blood run cold. He hadn't considered that possibility during their planning. If the raiders had tracking dogs, following their trail in the darkness would be simple. The scent of 15 people, some of them bleeding from wounds, would be easy to follow even for inexperienced hounds. "Thomas," Morningstar whispered urgently, "old Joseph is struggling. His chest injury is worse than we thought." Thomas looked back at the elderly man who had been their village's master storyteller. Joseph was trying to keep up, but his face was gray with pain and exhaustion. Blood had soaked through his shirt where a raider's bullet had creased his ribs. If they stopped to rest, they would all be captured. If they continued at their current pace, Joseph might collapse and die on the trail. "We carry him," Thomas decided. It would slow them down even more, but he wouldn't leave anyone behind. They fashioned a crude stretcher from branches and strips of clothing torn from their own garments. Two of the younger men took the first shift carrying Joseph, while Thomas continued to lead the group up the increasingly difficult trail. His leg throbbed with every step, and he could feel warm wetness in his boot that meant his old injury was bleeding again. The trail wound around a steep cliff face where they had to move in single file, pressed against the rock wall with a deadly drop on their other side. This was where Thomas had always been most grateful for his natural balance and sure footing. Now, with his damaged leg, each step was an act of faith. One misstep would send him tumbling into the darkness below, probably taking others with him. Halfway across the cliff traverse, they heard the sound that Thomas had been dreading. Dogs barking in the distance, coming from the direction of the village. The raiders had indeed brought hounds, and they were already on the trail. "They're following our scent," whispered one of the young men carrying Joseph's stretcher. "How far to the cave?" asked Morningstar. Thomas tried to gauge their position in the darkness. The familiar landmarks were harder to identify at night, especially while dealing with pain and exhaustion. "Another mile, maybe more, but it's the hardest part of the trail." The barking was getting closer. Thomas could hear human voices mixed with the baying of the hounds, and occasionally the flicker of torches appeared through the trees below them. The raiders were moving faster than Thomas's group could manage, and they were gaining ground steadily. "We need to split up," Thomas decided, hating himself for even suggesting it. "Some of us create a false trail while the others continue to the cave." "No," Morningstar said firmly. "We stay together. All of us reach safety or none of us do." It was exactly what Thomas would have expected his sister to say, and exactly what he would have said himself in her position. Their people didn't abandon each other, even when practical considerations suggested they should. But practicality might be the only thing that saved any of them. Before Thomas could argue further, they heard something that changed everything. Gunshots erupted from the village below, but these weren't the random shots of celebration or panic they had heard earlier. This was the disciplined firing of someone fighting for their life. And Thomas knew it had to be Sarah. "She's still alive," he said, hardly daring to believe it. "And still fighting," added Morningstar. "That woman has the heart of a warrior." The sound of battle below seemed to energize the fleeing prisoners. If Sarah was still risking her life for them, they couldn't give up now. They moved faster despite their exhaustion, helping each other over obstacles and pushing through pain that would have stopped them under normal circumstances. The dogs were much closer now, their barking echoing off the cliff walls. Thomas estimated they were perhaps 10 minutes behind. close enough that he could occasionally make out individual voices among the pursuers. But the cave entrance was finally within reach, hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines that would be nearly invisible even in daylight. There, Thomas pointed to what looked like solid rock face. Behind those vines, the entrance was narrow, requiring them to squeeze through one at a time. Getting Joseph's stretcher through took precious minutes they didn't have. But finally all 15 refugees were inside the cave. Thomas was the last to enter, pausing to listen for their pursuers. The dogs sounded like they were right at the base of the final climb. In a few more minutes, the raiders would reach this section of trail and begin searching for the cave entrance. Thomas knew the vines provided good concealment, but if the dogs caught their scent directly, no amount of camouflage would help. Inside the cave, the prisoners huddled together in the darkness. The space was larger than it appeared from outside, with several chambers connected by narrow passages. Thomas had explored every inch of these caves as a child, playing hide-and-seek with other village children. Now that childhood knowledge might mean the difference between life and death. Further back, he whispered, guiding them toward the deepest chamber. Sound doesn't carry as much from there. They moved carefully through the darkness, feeling their way along the cave walls. The wounded were suffering, but they endured in silence, understanding that a single moan or cough could betray them all. Thomas took up position near the entrance, straining to hear what was happening outside. The dogs arrived first, their barking becoming frantic as they picked up the scent trail. Thomas could hear them running back and forth outside the cave, confused by the way the trail seemed to disappear. Then human voices joined the chorus, and Thomas recognized the harsh tone of the raider leader. "They came this way," the man was saying. "Dogs don't lie about scent. But where the hell did they go?" "Maybe they doubled back," suggested another voice. "Or maybe they're holed up somewhere close," the leader replied. "Spread out. Search every crack and crevice. They can't have just vanished." Thomas held his breath as footsteps approached the cave entrance. Through the vines he could see the flickering light of a torch so close he could feel its warmth. The raider holding it was examining the cliff face, looking for any sign of a hiding place. The torchlight flickered mere inches from Thomas's face as the raider examined the vine-covered entrance. Thomas pressed himself against the cave wall, knowing that even the slightest movement might give them away. Behind him in the darkness he could hear the shallow breathing of 15 terrified people trying to remain perfectly still. "Nothing here but rock and weeds," the raider muttered, moving the torch closer to the vines. One of the trailing vines actually brushed against the flame, and Thomas was certain their hiding place had been discovered. But the raider was looking for an obvious cave mouth, not a narrow opening hidden behind vegetation. After a few more seconds that felt like hours, he moved on to search other sections of the cliff face. Thomas allowed himself to breathe again, though his heart was still pounding loud enough that he feared it might be audible. The search continued for what seemed like an eternity. The raiders were thorough, checking every possible hiding spot within 100 yards of where the trail had ended. The dogs kept returning to the area near the cave entrance, whining with frustration that they could smell their quarry but couldn't locate them precisely. "Maybe they fell," suggested one of the searchers. "Could have missed their footing in the dark and gone over the cliff." "Then where are the bodies?" the leader demanded. Dogs would smell death just as strong as life. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to think like his enemy. The raider leader was no fool. He had successfully attacked multiple villages and evaded pursuit for weeks. He wouldn't give up easily, especially when he knew his prisoners were valuable both as slaves and as examples to other tribes who might consider resistance. As if reading Thomas's thoughts, the leader's voice rose again. "We'll wait them out. Post guards at the bottom of the trail and at the top. They have to come out eventually for water and food. When they do, we'll be ready." This was exactly what Thomas had feared. The cave had no water source, and they had fled with no food supplies. The wounded needed medical attention, and everyone was already exhausted from the night's ordeal. They couldn't survive a siege of more than a few days at most, but as the raiders settled into their positions, Thomas heard something that gave him hope. Sarah's rifle was still firing sporadically from the direction of the village. She was not only alive but still actively engaging the enemy. Her continued resistance was keeping some of the raiders busy and preventing them from committing their full force to the search. "Thomas," Morningstar whispered so quietly he could barely hear her, "Joseph is getting worse. He needs help soon." Thomas felt his way through the darkness to where the old storyteller lay. Joseph's breathing was shallow and labored, and his skin felt hot with fever. The bullet wound was bleeding again, probably torn open during their difficult climb. Without proper treatment, he might not survive another day. "I have to get him to the village healer," Thomas whispered back. "The village healer is probably dead," Morningstar replied grimly. "And even if she's not, how would you get past the raiders?" Thomas considered their options. The cave system was larger than what his people had traditionally used. As a boy, he had explored passages that led deeper into the mountain, though he had never mapped them completely. Some of those tunnels might emerge far enough away to avoid the raider sentries. "There are other ways out," he told Morningstar. "Passages that lead toward the high meadows. I could take Joseph and try to reach Sarah. She might know something about treating wounds." "You can barely walk yourself," Morningstar protested. "How can you carry Joseph through unknown tunnels?" "Because I have to," Thomas replied simply. "We can't all just wait here to die." He made his way to the back of the cave where the other survivors huddled together for warmth. Speaking in the barest whisper, he explained his plan. 2 of the younger men would help him carry Joseph through the back passages, while the others remained hidden. If they could reach the village without being detected, they might be able to find medical supplies or even locate Sarah. The plan was desperate and dangerous, but everyone agreed it was better than doing nothing. They prepared Joseph for transport as carefully as possible, knowing that the rough journey through narrow cave passages would be agony for him. Thomas took the lead, relying on childhood memories to navigate tunnels he hadn't entered in years. The passages were even more difficult than Thomas remembered. Some were so narrow they had to crawl on hands and knees, dragging Joseph behind them on their makeshift stretcher. Thomas's injured leg screamed with every movement, and he could feel fresh blood soaking through his clothing. But Joseph's labored breathing drove him forward, reminding him that he wasn't the only one suffering. After what felt like hours of crawling through darkness, they finally saw light ahead. Not the orange glow of torches, but the pale gray of approaching dawn, filtering through another cave entrance. Thomas's heart sank as he realized how much time had passed. Daylight would make their rescue attempt far more dangerous. The new entrance opened onto a high meadow about a mile above the village, exactly where Thomas had hoped it would. But as they emerged into the pre-dawn light, they could see the full scope of the disaster that had befallen his people. The village was a ruin of burned buildings and scattered belongings. Smoke still rose from several structures, and even from their distant vantage point they could see bodies lying in the central square. "Dear spirits," whispered one of the young men, "is anyone down there still alive?" Thomas studied the scene below, looking for any signs of life. Most of the raiders appeared to be sleeping off their night of drinking and searching, but he could see sentries posted at key points around the perimeter. And there, near the burned remains of his family's longhouse, Sarah worked on Joseph's wound with steady hands despite her own injuries. Thomas watched in amazement as she cleaned the bullet hole with whiskey from a small bottle in her pack, then used a pair of thin metal tools to probe for the bullet. Joseph remained unconscious throughout the procedure, which was probably a mercy given the pain he would have experienced. "There," Sarah breathed as she finally extracted a flattened piece of lead. "Got it." She quickly packed the wound with clean cloth and bound it tightly. "He's still in danger from infection, but at least the bullet isn't tearing him up inside anymore." Thomas felt a surge of gratitude toward this remarkable woman who kept risking everything for his people. "How can I ever repay you for this?" "Help me finish what we started," Sarah replied, wiping blood from her hands. "Those raiders destroyed my life in your village, but they haven't won yet. We still have 15 people who need to get to safety, and I still have a promise to keep to my husband." "What do you mean?" Morningstar asked. Sarah's expression hardened with determination. "Before those bastards killed him, my husband made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd get word to his brother in the territorial capital. His brother's a federal marshal with connections to the military. If we can reach him with proof of what's happening here, he can bring enough soldiers to stop this raiding party permanently." Thomas considered this. "How far is the territorial capital?" 4 days hard riding, Sarah said. "Maybe 5 or 6 on foot, depending on the terrain." She looked meaningfully at Thomas's injured leg. "Problem is, someone needs to stay with the survivors and someone needs to make the journey, and neither of us is in great shape for a long trek through wilderness." "I'll go," Morningstar said immediately. "I know these mountains almost as well as Thomas, and I'm not injured." "Too dangerous," Thomas protested. "If the raiders catch you alone, if we all stay here, we die slowly," Morningstar replied firmly. "If we try to move 15 people, including wounded, the raiders will catch us for sure. But one person, traveling light and fast, might make it through." Sarah nodded approvingly. "She's right. And I can draw you a map to the capital, give you my husband's brother's name and address. Tell him what happened here, show him this." She pulled a small silver badge from her pocket. "It's my husband's deputy marshal badge. His brother will recognize it." Thomas felt torn between pride in his sister's courage and terror at the thought of her traveling alone through dangerous territory. But he knew she was right. It was their best chance, perhaps their only chance, of getting help for the survivors and justice for their dead. "What about the raiders?" he asked. "They're still watching the trails." Sarah smiled grimly. "That's where my explosives training comes in handy. I've got enough gunpowder left to create one hell of a distraction. While they're dealing with that, Morningstar can slip away on the far side of the mountain." They spent the next hour planning the escape in detail. Sarah would return to the village and set charges that would not only create chaos, but also convince the raiders that the escaped prisoners were trying to attack them. While the raiders were busy responding to this apparent assault, Morningstar would begin her journey to the territorial capital, using game trails that avoided the main routes. Thomas would lead the remaining survivors deeper into the cave system, to chambers he had discovered as a child that were virtually impossible to find unless you knew exactly where to look. They would wait there for either Morningstar's return with help, or for the raiders to give up and move on to easier targets. "There's one more thing," Sarah said as they prepared to part ways. "If I don't make it back from this distraction, you need to know something." She pulled out a hand-drawn map. "My cabin is about 10 miles northeast of here. Before the raiders burned it down, I buried supplies in the root cellar. Food, medical supplies, ammunition. The cellar survived the fire. If you need those supplies, they're yours." "You're coming back," Thomas said firmly. "We've made it this far together." Sarah looked at him with an expression that was both sad and determined. "I made a promise to my husband, Thomas, but I also made a promise to you last night. I said I'd lay down my life to help save your people if necessary. I meant that." Morningstar stepped forward and took Sarah's hands in hers. "In our tradition, when someone saves lives at great personal cost, they become family. You are my sister now, whether by blood or by choice. That means you have to survive because family doesn't abandon family." For the first time since Thomas had met her, Sarah's tough exterior cracked slightly. Tears gathered in her green eyes as she squeezed Morningstar's hands. "I'm not used to having family to worry about," she admitted. "Been on my own so long I forgot what it felt like to have people who cared whether I lived or died." "Now you remember," Thomas said. "So you be careful down there. We'll be waiting for you." Sarah nodded and checked her weapons one final time. The plan was dangerous for all of them, but it was better than simply waiting to be discovered or to slowly starve in the caves. She would create her distraction at midday, when most of the raiders would be awake and able to respond quickly. That would give Morningstar the maximum amount of daylight to begin her journey. As Sarah prepared to leave, she turned back to Thomas one more time. "That first night when I found you in the forest, I thought you were just another broken man who'd given up on life. I was wrong. You're the strongest person I've ever met, and your people are lucky to have you." "I'm the one who's lucky," Thomas replied. "Lucky that a mountain woman with the heart of a warrior decided a crippled scout was worth saving." Sarah smiled, and for a moment the hardness left her face completely. "Guess we saved each other, didn't we?" 3 hours later, the sound of explosions echoed across the valley as Sarah kept her word. Thomas watched from the cave entrance as smoke and fire erupted from multiple points around the village. The raiders responded exactly as predicted, rushing toward the apparent attack with shouts of anger and confusion. In the chaos, he saw a small figure moving swiftly along the ridgeline on the far side of the mountain. Morningstar was on her way, carrying their hopes for rescue and their trust in her courage. As she disappeared into the forest, Thomas whispered a prayer to the spirits of his ancestors to watch over her journey. 4 days later, as Thomas rationed the last of their water among the hidden survivors, they heard something that made everyone freeze in hope and terror. Horses approaching, but too many to be just the raiders. And then, cutting through the mountain air like the voice of salvation itself, came the sound of a bugle call. The cavalry had arrived. Morning Star had made it through and help had come at last. As Thomas emerged from the cave with his people, he saw Sarah standing among the uniformed soldiers, her arm in a proper sling but very much alive. She had kept both of her promises to her husband and to him. Later, as the raiders were led away in chains and the survivors received medical attention, Thomas found Sarah sitting alone by the stream that ran past the ruins of his village. "Thank you," he said simply, settling down beside her despite the pain in his leg. "Thank you," she replied, "for reminding me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds seem impossible." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed when they needed it most. Thomas was no longer the crippled scout who thought he had nothing left to offer. Sarah was no longer the grieving widow with nothing left to lose. Together they had become something more than either could have been alone. In the months that followed, as the village was rebuilt and the survivors healed, Thomas and Sarah discovered that the bond forged in crisis had grown into something deeper. She taught him new ways to use his skills despite his limitations. He showed her how to find peace in the rhythm of the seasons and the ancient wisdom of his people. The mountain woman had indeed laid down her life for the crippled scout, not in death but in the complete transformation of both their lives, and in saving each other, they had learned that sometimes the most broken people are exactly the ones who can help others become whole.